Well, good morning. We're back on our journey through the Bible. In fact, for the next few weeks, we want to take a trip through Timothy. And I'm calling your attention this morning to First Timothy chapter 1 and beginning in verse number 3. You're going to find that there are some tremendous, profound truths in Timothy that we really ought to understand and give heed to. Beginning in verse number 3, Paul had been with Timothy at Ephesus, and they had discussed some very important matters, and Paul had left Timothy at Ephesus. And later he writes to him, just emphasizing some of the things that are just really, really important. And I say that because sometimes the things that we're going to discuss this morning, just for a few minutes, most people really don't think it's that important. So beginning in First Timothy chapter 1 and verse number 3, I besought thee to abide or to stay still at Ephesus when I went to Macedonia. Perhaps Timothy really wanted to go with Paul, and Paul had to persuade him and urge him to stay at Ephesus. And then he goes on to say that thou mightest charge. And by the way, that word that he uses there, charge, really refers to a military term, which means to order. So there's a sense that goes deeper than persuasion, because Paul is commanded him that some that teach no other doctrine. And so one of the things that Paul and Timothy were faced with all the time was the danger and prevalence of false teaching. And so he's warning the brethren that they do not teach false teaching. And he'll go further and remind the brethren not to attach themselves to false teaching. By the way, that's what we're calling the lesson today, because some were holding on to false teaching that was really deteriorating the gospel. In fact, Paul will really say it's not the gospel, because the things that they were saying and people were attaching themselves to really wasn't the gospel at all. They were actually changing the very nature of the gospel. Now, I say that as we introduce the subject today, is that most people really don't think that doctrine matters. In fact, we have to convince even some among our own circle that doctrine truly does matter. It's just that important. In fact, if you remember, Jesus said that if you abide, that is, if you remain and live in my doctrine, this is John 8 and verse 31, then you are really my disciples. The King James says, indeed. And so what Jesus is saying, if you continue in my teaching, my doctrine, that's what the word means, by the way, doctrine is simply just teaching, then you really are my disciples. And so there was a danger right in the first century of the gospel being twisted and perverted to really it became no gospel at all. And so what he'll say is he's giving him a command, that is, Paul is commanding Timothy that they, that is, these people that were doing it, teach no other doctrine. And so in verse number 4, and it's an interesting thing, especially in our land today, Paul says, neither give heed to fables. Well, what's that? Those are things that have been invented. They're not true. They're fiction. They're myths. And so here are people that come up with all these kind of strange stories and fables and myths. And isn't it interesting that some have given themselves to that? Doesn't that sound like a whole lot of people sometimes? They have given themselves to things that are not true, things that are just way out there. And Paul was saying, don't get caught up in that nonsense, and don't give attention to it. Just don't bother with that business at all. And then he goes on to say, with endless genealogies, and this just means things that just never end. Do you ever notice that? You get with some folks and they're so tied up in some things that it just never comes to any kind of conclusion. In fact, it's a lot of empty talk. If you look down in verse number 6, where he talks about some have swerved, have turned to this vain jangling. We don't use that word ever get much at all. In fact, I don't know if anybody ever said it to me, but it just refers to empty talk that just goes on and on and on and on that just doesn't have any meaning. And so what Paul was saying, stay out of that business. Don't get yourself involved in it. In fact, I must say this, a lot of our talk is just about things that just really, really don't matter. And I wonder sometimes when anybody really gets down to some real serious thought and talk. And it's important that we really give some consideration and attention to that, talk about some things that just really matter. And so what Paul is saying here, he's telling Timothy just stay away from that business and charge the brethren there, because the false teachers have come up among them, that don't teach that stuff. In fact, what Paul will say a little later, that those that are teaching don't even know what they're talking about. Isn't that a fact? And so what he's saying here is that this is so vital and it's so important that we stick to the doctrine. Now, it's kind of interesting. A thing happened just the other day. I've had two people ask me about Matthew chapter 27, and if you're familiar, there's a lot of incidents that were supernatural there, the veil being ripped apart, and there's an earthquake in Matthew chapter 27. And if you remember that particular event, when the earthquake and the rock split and all of that, some had actually come out of the grave. The some there are called the saints, and they go into the city. Imagine that. This had to be something else. Just think for just a moment, if you knew some people that had died a year ago or 6 months ago or whatever it was ago in the past, and all of a sudden they go into the city where you live and there they are. I mean, that would have been something else. But the question that was asked to me was, what do you think happened to those people? You know what I said? I don't know, and nobody else does either. I mean, we just don't know. And so you can speculate and give your opinion and all of that stuff, but it just gets down to nobody knows what happened. And that's what I'm trying to emphasize. We've become so gullible in a sophisticated intellectual society, and yet it's rather amazing how oftentimes from day to day to day to day, we get caught up in things that just have no substance whatsoever. And so what we're saying today is here, you've got to know what the Bible says, and we're going to talk a whole lot about that, especially in our trip through Timothy, how important it is that doctrine truly, really matters. See you tomorrow.